Hey y'all, it's Stephen Van Kampen-Lewis, and today I want to talk a little bit about Cattleyas in dormancy in winter. And so I talk a lot about catasetums on my channel and their dormancy period that everybody sort of knows about and thinks about, or at least the people that are growing catasetums usually know about. And of course, the catasetum rest is typically a very hard rest with a little bit of water every now and then. But Cattleyas have a dormancy period as well, and there's a few species that really need a distinct dormancy period with no or little water during that time in order for them to bloom well or grow well or not rot or whatever. So I want to talk a little bit about that today. And the reason I'm doing this is someone asked me in a comment, hey, can you do a video about dormancy for Cattleya warscewiczii? And I was thinking to myself, I'm like, yeah, I should. That's a good idea. And I wish I could remember who it was. And my apologies for not remembering. I went through my comments and I couldn't find it. YouTube is not very user-friendly for people like myself that make the videos. But I started thinking about warscewiczii, and I was like, well, that's not the only one that goes through kind of a dry period in order for it to do well. So I figured I'd just talk a little bit about the Cattleyas that I grow and the ones that I know about and what they do during winter, or what you as the grower, owner, cultivator of these Cattleyas should probably be doing. And I should say that I'm talking about this species because the hybrids that goes all out the window, I guess. But let me sort of lump most of the Unifoliates in with the hybrids, especially the complex hybrids. Complex hybrids for just about any genera are pretty much bulletproof. When it comes to growing, what they need, what they require, they're very forgiving. And when I say bulletproof, I mean they're forgiving of mistakes. They can take a wide variety. Typically, they can take a wide variety of cultural conditions and do well, or at least do well enough to bloom and not die, right? Whereas some of the species are gonna die if you sneeze on them, and I'm being dramatic, but you know what I mean. And so I want to talk a little bit about those. And I'm going to start with the sort of easiest group, which is the sort of unifoliate Cattleyas, most of them. I'll talk a little bit more about the exceptions, and there's 3 of them. But most of the unifoliates and the complex hybrids, I'm going to group those as a single sort of category. And when it comes to winter dormancy, you're going to keep the light the same. You're going to want to change the day length. And this is true for all of these ones. You're going to want to change the day length through the winter and summer, throughout the year. I find the easiest way to do that is with a CASA timer. And it's a timer that I can actually manipulate from my phone. It's cheaper than the timers that are sort of analog and are on a little clicky thing, and then you kind of manually set the time. So it's on your phone, so it's easier to deal with. And you can just click a button and it will automatically have sunrise and sunset that matches your own sunrise and sunset. So you hit that button, and when the sun pops up in the morning, no matter where you are, your lights are going to turn on at the same time. And when the sun goes down in the evening, no matter where you are, what time of year, the lights are going to turn off at the same time. And so that'll give your plants seasonal cues in the form of light. Now, most of us growing inside, especially during the winter, we're going to have similar conditions probably throughout the day, maybe even throughout the night. But the dormancy that I'm really focused on today is watering and fertilizing to a lesser extent. Fertilizing is an easy one to take care of. You can either just shut off your fertilizer no matter what to all your plants. That's what I do. It's just easier. Or you can back off from the fertilizer, because most of your plants are probably not going to be doing a whole lot of growth during the coldest part of the year, the winter. And so fertilizer, back off totally, or just cut it. The light, you'll want to keep the light bright, and you'll want to keep the light changing day length throughout the year, including winter. And then the watering for unifoliates and the complex hybrids is just less. And the reason it's less is typically the air temperature that they're dealing with is less, so the media dries out less quickly, dries out more slowly, right? Additionally, if your plants aren't growing, they're not really going to be doing a whole lot of photosynthesis and putting on new growth, so they don't need as much water. They need just enough water to keep their metabolism up during the sort of boring period where they're typically not doing a whole lot. And most of the unifoliates are typically not doing anything in winter. Of course, there's always exceptions. And some of the hybrids, the complex hybrids, might be growing through the winter. In that case, you might consider watering a little more often, but probably not really a whole lot. And when I say less often or more often, I'm thinking about the amount of water that you are giving your Cattleyas during the active growing period, typically spring, summer, and maybe into fall. So you back off on that water to maybe even cut it in half for the unifoliate species and the hybrids. And you'll want to play with that a little bit and see if your plants start to shrivel a little bit. If the bulbs start to shrivel a little bit, it's probably not a big deal. But if they shrivel a lot, then you might want to up the watering a little bit to sort of figure out what the best schedule is. So all of my plants, all of my Cattleyas are potted in large grade Orchiata bark that's real big. And almost always they're in clay pots. And so for me, in my conditions, that means that I'm watering 1 to 2 times per week. And that seems to be just fine for them. They're usually bone dry by the time I water them. So during the growing season, I like to say, let your Cattleyas approach dryness, but never really get dry. In the wintertime, you can let the media get totally dry. Now, I mentioned that there are 3 exceptions to the unifoliate rule, where basically you just back off water a little bit. And that's warscewiczii, Rex, and dowiana. And all 3 of those are actually really closely related and grow in similar conditions. And they actually need a little bit harder of a winter rest for watering than the other species. Rex will want a little less, and I haven't grown adult Rexes myself, so I'm going on what the literature says. And if you want to know more about Cattleya Rex, definitely check out My Green Pets. William Green has been growing those for a long time now, and he has been very generous with his information of how to grow these. So Rex is going to want less water, significantly less water in wintertime. And then dowiana and warscewiczii are 2 that I'm much more familiar with. Dowiana is going to want really almost no water if possible. Watch for those bulbs if they start to shrivel. If they start to shrivel, then water on a warm day and make sure it dries off really quickly. Rex is kind of like a catasetum in that it really wants to rot. Rex is also completely intolerant of cold, so keep your winter nighttime temperatures above 55. Above 60 is even better. But for dowiana, keeping your temperatures warm in the house, or at least in the grow space, and then really giving as little water as possible, it is beneficial for the plant to not rot on you. Now, warscewiczii is not nearly as prone to rot, but if you ever want to see flowers, you need to not water. And I have experimented by giving my warscewiczii extremely harsh winters just to see how much they could take, and they didn't get water for months, maybe once or twice. And then they would have amazing flushes of blooms in the spring. And so with warscewiczii, you want to have no water from fall-ish, late fall, early winter, let's say November, December, and then no water until the new growth is about 4 inches long. And I found that information from Art Chadwick's book. And he has an amazing book on the Unifoliate Cattleyas. And in that he describes, warscewiczii being very temperamental in their generosity with their flowers. And I mentioned that I experimented by giving a very hard winter rest, and that was successful. I also experimented with my warscewiczii, giving them a wetter winter rest, or just sort of watering them at the same time I water my other Cattleyas. And those, I didn't get blooms in the spring. So it is a real thing. You want to not water your warscewiczii. Watch for shriveling, of course. If you can, for all three of these species, try to keep your temperatures warm and your humidity high. The sort of low humidity, 20% range that we often get inside in the United States for wintertime, during wintertime, is not ideal for those. And that lack of watering at the roots and then the low humidity can really stress the plants out quite a bit, and you might see more shriveling than you otherwise would. So to recap, most of the unifoliates and the hybrids just need a little less water in the wintertime. Rex, dowiana, and warscewiczii, much less water, especially if you don't want to rot them. Or for warscewiczii, if you want to see blooms in the spring, and let's face it, you want to see warscewiczii blooms in the spring. They're so cool, and they just smell great, and it's definitely worthwhile to grow really all three of those species. So the next group that I want to talk about are the bifoliates. And when I say bifoliate, I'm talking about things like Eclandii, Gutata, Tigrina, Schilleriana, and that group, that cluster of bifoliates that typically have 2 leaves, or if you're growing them really well, they should have really 3 or 4 leaves per growth. So in those, in their natural habitat, they do get less rain in winter, but the fact that they have much smaller and skinnier pseudobulbs tells you that their water storage organs are not particularly robust when it comes to water storage or nutrient storage during drought. And I've actually found that if you just keep watering them all winter long and don't really back off on the water, they'll just keep growing. And there doesn't seem, at least in my experience, there doesn't seem to be a downside to that. None of them are really going to be not blooming in the spring if you continue to water and they continue to grow. They seem just fine with it. So that's my preferred strategy for that particular group. Now, of course, if a plant is actively growing, you can fertilize it. It does make sense. I still don't. My growths, I think what happens with mine is that there's enough fertilizer within the media itself that the plants and orchids have such an incredibly low need for additional nutrients to the media that amount of fertilizer that's left in the basket or the pot is enough to get that winter flush of growth up and running and blooming just fine and growing just fine without fertilizer. So you can fertilize, but you don't have to. And I've tried it both ways. When you have a big collection, just treating all of your plants the same is just so much easier than giving individual treatment to each one, unless it's really special, like a nice dowiana or rex or warscewiczii. So the bifoliates are pretty easy. My experience, keep watering them, fertilize if you want, keep them warm, of course, and that's about it. I talk about Unifoliates being fairly easy with their repotting and bifoliates being very complicated. When it comes to watering and dormancy, they're sort of inverse. Bifoliates are much easier, and the unifoliates can be more tricky. Now I want to talk about some of the drought-tolerant bifoliates that don't necessarily fit neatly into the bifoliate category. And that, of course, is walkeriana, Nobilior, and Nobilior variety Amalii. Now, all three of them in their natural habitat are very drought tolerant of no rain in winter or little rain in winter. So Nobilior variety Amalii is the most drought tolerant, and you can just straight up cut off water to them all winter long and treat them like a catasetum if you want, because that's what they receive in nature. Nobilior, the regular tipo variety, which is a disjunct population from the Amalii variety, is less drought tolerant, but you can still give them a pretty harsh, dry winter rest if you want. Walkeriana is a little less drought tolerant, but it's still very drought tolerant. So there's sort of this descending order or increasing order of xeric conditions in their natural wintertime rainfall. Now, just because these three plants or these two species and one variety can take very dry winters doesn't mean you have to do that or even that you should do that in cultivation. I used to give them all pretty hard winter rests, and my friend Luis Hamilton Lima wrote to me and was like, hey, just because they get very hard winter rests, very dry winters in their native habitat doesn't mean that they need it or that you should do it. In fact, he said, if you look at the best Brazilian growers and their best walkerianas and nobiliors, you don't see shriveled bulbs on those plants when they're blooming. And that's because they're still getting water and they're still blooming just fine. And so, I took that to heart and I started watering, especially my Amaliis. I give them more water than I used to, and there's more flowers. So, they will bloom if very dry, but you'll get more flowers if you give them some water. Now, that said, all three of those really should be getting much drier winter conditions than what you give them during the growing season. So during the growing season, again, I never let them dry out fully. They approach dryness, they get pretty close, but that media is still damp. Like I'll stick my finger down there and it'll still come back up as damp, somewhat damp. So during winter time, what I typically do is I'll water them once a week or once every other week. So rather than just being no water at all, I'm giving less water than the rest of my Cattleya collection, but I'm still watering once or twice a month, or once a week to once every other week. So, maybe 2 to 4 times per month, and that's really based on how hot it is in the growing area that they have. So I have them, I used to have them in my greenhouse, and it would just get baked with sun sometimes, here in Texas, but then just frozen other times. Of course, I would have a heater. And the same thing happens in my grow tents now, where I grow them inside my garage. So, the past week has been pretty warm, so I'm watering them a bit more. If we get cold conditions in typically January and early February, and my temperatures in the grow space decrease, I will have a correspondingly drier condition at the roots for those particular plants. Now, I just mentioned that if you have a big collection, you want to water your plants all the same way, all year round. And that is true. That makes your life infinitely easier. But if there's some really tricky ones out there that need somewhat different conditions, it seems to be in winter, and it seems to be, like I mentioned, warscewiczii, dowiana, rex, walkeriana, Nobilior Amalii. And, if it's just part and parcel. If you have those during wintertime, maybe you give them slightly different conditions than the rest of your Cattleyas. But then during the growing season, which is, spring, summer, and fall, you can treat them all the same. And finally, I don't want to make this video too long, but I do want to make mention of the Cattleyas that used to be Laelias. And of course, that's the Rupiculous Cattleyas, the ones that I've spoken about recently and ordered a bunch, actually, from Brazil. The Rupiculous ones are the little ones that grow on rocks. Typically, they're like this big to this big, and somewhere in between, they have these long spikes or kind of short spikes, but of smallish flowers, very brightly colored, typically yellow, orange, and pink. Those ones you can give a pretty hard winter rest. Based on what I saw, those plants in nature didn't have water for months, and they didn't shrivel at all. So if you have a plant of that group, they can take a pretty hard winter rest. So again, you can water them maybe once a week or once every other week, and they'll be just fine, or even just not at all. I'm gonna start experimenting with how hard of a winter rest they prefer with my own plants, and then I'll report back to y'all. The other group is the Hadrolaelias group, and that's like dowiana, cinchorana, allelorii, pumila, jonghyana, and I think prestans. So I think that's that whole group. I am less familiar with that group than I am with the other ones that I've mentioned. So I do want to say that I was in the habitat of cinchorana and jonghyana, and they do get a pretty dry rest. My understanding is that the rest of that group are not forgiving of a dry winter rest. So if you have those and you're wondering about them, I would look those up and spend a little bit of time thinking about how you're going to approach those. My understanding is that cinchorana, I have one plant of that species that I'm growing now, cinchorana and jonghyana, which grows too cool for me, so I can't grow it, even though I would love to. They both they are fine with a drier winter rest. The rest of that group is not going to be happy and might even just straight up die on you. So keep that in mind. Anyway, if I've overlooked some, or you have some other ones that I should have talked about, let me know in the comments, and we can chat further. Hope you have a great weekend. Bye.